The Hate You Give, Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, The Perks of Being a Wallflower. Now, these three books have two things in common: movie adaptations and multiple bans from school libraries. You know, there's been a greater push to ban more books from school libraries in recent years, and it's succeeding. According to the American Library Association, 2022 saw more book bans and restrictions than any other year on record. More than 1,200 book challenges were made, doubling the total in 2021. But a recent Washington Post op-ed gave hope to book lovers, giving multiple ways that people can fight against these bans. Alyssa Rosenberg joins us now. She's a columnist for the Washington Post and the author of that op-ed article, How to Fight Book Bans and Win. Alyssa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So you wrote this op-ed on not just how to fight book bans, but how to win them as well. And in that article, you talked about how these bans equate to censorship. I understand that the Wall Street Journal conducted a poll on book bans. What did it find exactly?
Well, look, censorship is not popular. Censorship of books for children is not popular. I mean, if you look at the Wall Street Journal's results, what they found is that people are actually more concerned that books that are relevant and interesting and important might be taken away from children than that they might actually accidentally get something that isn't age appropriate, that a specific child isn't quite ready for. And so, you know, look, it is, I think, it can be a little overwhelming when, you know, someone makes a moral argument or it makes a serious allegation about, you know, doing something inappropriate to children. But, you know, those requests to censor books are not popular. They're not mainstream. They're not mainstream even among Republicans. And so, you know, first off, people who want their libraries to be wide-ranging and expansive should be confident that they are in the majority. And I think that's sort of an important base observation for people to take into these arguments.
Now, another thing that you mentioned in your article is that one thing people might not think of when it comes to these book bans is how much it could essentially cost the government. What do you mean by this exactly?
Well, look, I mean, school librarians and, you know, public librarians are city employees, they're town employees. And so if you pass a law that makes your librarians legally liable if they provide certain material to certain library patrons, that could increase the insurance costs for your town a whole lot, right? I mean, if you pass a law that opens your city or your town up to lawsuits, the city or the town is going to have to pay more money in insurance premiums, so they're protected when they need to fight those suits. Also, you know, as we know from the past, there are laws against viewpoint discrimination in public libraries. There was a series of cases the ACLU fought in the late 90s, early aughts, where they challenged public libraries that were using, you know, internet filtering software that blocked access to groups like Lambda Legal or PFLAG and, you know, these sort of gay rights groups. But they would allow library users to access websites for ex-gay ministries or for conversion therapy. And the ACLU successfully argued in court in multiple places that this filtering software, you know, was discriminating based on the political viewpoint of the people who had organized it. And you can't do that, right? I mean, you can't, for example, ban books from a library because they're Marxist, because they are, you know, or because they're conservative. And so, you know, if a town shows a pattern of kicking books out of libraries because they are supportive to LGBTQ characters, if they're by Black authors who have certain politics, those towns could be sued and they could lose. And even if they don't lose, fighting a lawsuit like that is expensive. And there are national organizations that will file those lawsuits on behalf of books, on behalf of book lovers everywhere. And so, you know, as much as library politics have been nationalized, libraries are administered on the local level, and administering them and administering censorship has local costs. And so that can be a very effective argument if you're talking about sort of the practical details of, you know, whether or not you actually want to remove books from a library, whether or not you actually want to potentially criminalize librarianship. And so I think those practical arguments can have huge weight, and we've seen them work.
I want to go ahead and focus on the impact that this could have across the country, though, because in your opinion, what does it mean for our nation? What does it mean for the nation's young people if something like this continues and more books are banned?
Well, and look, as I've heard in my reporting, it's not that librarians are sewing books about, being gay or critical race theory on shelves to convert kids. These aren't, intellectual IEDs. These are the books that are challenged, I've heard over and over, are the books that children are asking for. They're the books that kids need because they're trying to understand their evolving sexual orientation. They are the books that kids need because they are coping with a developing disability, like the onset of hearing loss, or because in their own home they are dealing with violence or sexual abuse. And so, I think if these books are taken away from children, that doesn't protect kids. Maybe it protects parents from having to have a difficult conversation. Maybe it protects them from having to justify their own values. But, taking a book away from a child or making sure that they don't have access to that book in the first place doesn't remove that child from the world. It doesn't wrap them up in a protective bubble. It just takes away a resource for them to understand their own experiences and the world around them.
And circling back to that Wall Street Journal poll that we began the interview with, you were saying that censorship is not popular, that most people who responded to the poll did not support a book ban or book bans of any nature. So I wanted to ask you about your op-ed title, because you call it How to Fight Book Bans and Win. So for folks out there who are watching and they're curious, how do you win specifically? What do you have to say about that?
Well, part of it is just that you show up, right? I mean, you have this fight over whether to ban some books in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, and the person who's requested that the books be removed doesn't show up to a critical library control board meeting. But people who cared about those specific titles and found them important to their lives showed up, testified about the importance of the books, and they won. They stayed on the shelves. And so, I think that first step is showing up. The second is tailoring your arguments closely and locally to your community. We were talking about the costs of book censorship, and that's a really valuable one. If you know that your town's budget is constrained, point out that there could be financial costs here. Another line of argument that advocates have found really effective is pointing out how laws would affect specific books. You have parents in states like Utah who have challenged whether the Bible should be on library shelves on the grounds that it contains depictions of incest, violence, rape, all sorts of adult themes, but also pointing out that books like The Diary of Anne Frank would be removed from shelves, or in Texas that legislation that's been introduced there would remove the work of Larry McMurtry, who's an incredibly beloved Texas author, from school shelves. Those kinds of arguments are very effective. Once people realize what the impact of a law would be, I think that can be very effective. And also, reminding people of what libraries are and what they do, right? Libraries are collections that are built over time by different people, different tastes, different priorities. They have to serve the demands of everyone in the community. So a book that one person finds offensive, another person might find vital, and a library has an obligation to both of those people, to all of those families with different values. And reminding people also of the relationships that they have with librarians in their town, saying, look, do you think this person is out there trying to do something bad to your kids? Do you think this person is out there trying to harm the community? You know this person. They signed you up for your library card. And, remind people that they're empowered, especially with children. It's not like a 4-year-old can go to a library and get a card without his or her parents' consent, unless it's an incredibly precocious 4-year-old or like 2 4-year-olds in a trench coat. And, in a lot of places, parents have to be with their kids when they browse. And so, it's one thing to talk about parental rights and then offload those parental responsibilities onto a sort of fictional vision of a teacher or a librarian. It's another thing to exercise your right to be parentally responsible yourself.
The article is called How to Fight Book Bans and Win. Alyssa Rosenberg with The Washington Post. Alyssa, thank you so much for your time, your insight, and of course your attention to this issue. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up next, a case before the Supreme Court which could impact your job. We're going to take a closer look at what the High